Chaotic would have been a rather nice way of describing James's attempts to decide on a reaction to the new situation he found himself in. Ultimately, there was of course no way he would get around reporting what he had found out here, especially since there were more witnesses than just him and Shida. And even if he could have somehow convinced the Major of not sharing what he had heard in the cockpit of that little shuttle with the rest of humanity, which was already pretty much an impossibility, there was still no universe in which the pilot would have kept up his silence on the matter for very long. Therefore, it was up to them to quickly think of an approach that would allow them to even get out a sentence beyond "there's a realized AI" before all of the standard protocols would kick in, and thus brand Avezalon as a new target number one for not just humanity, but the entire rest of the galaxy as well. James wasn't handling it too well, especially since he was apparently still fighting a mental battle with himself regarding if he was even doing the right thing here. He had by now acknowledged that it would at least be prudent to give Avezalon a chance, mostly because they had been nothing but friendly and helpful ever since they had first encountered each other, but that didn't mean he had gotten over a lifetime of learned behaviour yet. In fact, the only things that truly seemed to keep him anchored to Avezalon's side of things were 1. The proof of their continued existence over many years without any evidence of them ever causing conflict, beyond the very recent protests and supply chain problems, and 2. Shida's insistence on it. Still, it couldn't be said that he wasn't giving it his all in trying to provide them a fighting chance. After the brief moment of respite he had allowed himself together with Shida, right after they had arrived back on their ship, his last 15 or so hours had been spent trying to gather evidence and formulating a case for the seemingly non-violent artificial sapience that apparently originated on Dunima. After all, he would have to make it decisive if he wanted anybody to listen to him. At least Dunima had made it quite clear that they shouldn't expect any more hostilities from the Mia side of things, most likely because they were more than aware that a first set of reports had already been sent back to Earth, and a sudden loss of contact would spell a more certain disaster than the humans possibly coming by to wipe out an AI. Shida could only assume that Avezalon was also influencing their decision somehow, possibly with their assurance that any attack that may come their way would in fact target them specifically instead of razing the entire planet to the ground. As her own stamina didn't really compare to that of her human partner, Shida herself was forced to at least take a short break a few hours in, as both her mind and body had absolutely refused to keep working correctly for any longer after the stress of the preceding day. Though the loud alarm of her phone awoke her after only about 3 hours of sleep, immediately her hand shot out to search for it, as her still very much tired brain tried to silence the annoying sound in order to get more well-deserved rest. But in an aware moment of foresight, she had actually placed the device out of her reach, on the other side of the room, in fact, and since it showed no signs of ever stopping its incessant beeping that was piercing into her sensitive ears, she now had no choice but to get up to her feet. Groggily, she slowly shambled the last few steps over to where she had put the darn thing, and once she decidedly pressed it into silence again, she carefully inspected the wounds on her face with the tips of her fingers. The soft skin around her cheeks, that had been so violently cut open, was still rather tender under her new, fresh bandage. However, the skin adhesive that had been applied to it in the meantime was already doing its work rather well, and the largest part of the previously piercing and scalding pain her face had been in had subsided, though it would definitely still leave scars. For a second, the urge to just lie down again and spend most likely the next uniform day unconscious was alluringly calling her back to the soft covers of her bed, especially as a dull haze seemed to be filling all her senses from sheer overuse. But Shida determinedly overruled it, turning on her feet and decidedly marching out of the room, where the siren call could no longer reach her. Although, admittedly, at this point she wouldn't have been above just sleeping on the floor either. As she shuffled her way through the halls of their accompanying ship, that was barely larger than a house, taking one step at a time, while her sense of gravity was still adjusting to actually having to do work again, she could hear voices energetically talking to each other almost immediately. "Honestly, this could change everything though," the Major's weathered voice said, slightly muffled by the distance. "I mean, imagine the possibilities." His pondering was quickly interrupted by what sounded like a heavy weight being dropped onto a desk, accompanied by an exasperated exhale. "Well, it's not going to be anything if we don't find a way to get people to believe us about this," James's voice replied, right before the sounds of quick clicking on a keyboard began. "And I'll be lucky if I'm not court-martialed for even suggesting this, so forgive me if I'll think about possible uses later." The Major grunted slightly. Well, if you can't find a way, it might still be worth it to just cut your losses, he suggested. And it sounded like he was clacking his nails against some hard surface as he pondered aloud. If you lose all your support because of this, it won't help anybody. Especially if that AI still gets canned right after. A Vesalon, James mumbled distractedly. The Major replied, confused. I'm trying to remind myself to use their name, James said, not in an accusing tone. It seemed like he was just stating a fact. Can't start acting like they are just something we are talking about here, or we've already lost. I think that's the important bit. We're trying to prove the innocence of a person here, not the harmlessness of some machine. And I'll have to make my case accordingly. The Major made a contemplative sound, but didn't immediately reply to that. Shida had come to a brief halt just outside of the room the two were talking in, just listening to the conversation for a bit longer. But now she felt like this was her place to chime in. And will everyone else accept that as well? She asked as she walked in, seeing James sitting hunched over in front of a small computer, still tapping away at the keyboard with swift fingers, while the Major sat next to him on top of the table, concentratedly reading something on the screen of a tablet while clacking against its back with his nails. Both men briefly looked up at her as she came in, James flashing her a quick, tired smile, while the Major just quickly nodded in acknowledgement of her presence. Neither of them seemed surprised that she had overheard the conversation, and now integrated herself into it seamlessly, as if she had been part of it from the beginning. Slept well, Treasure? James caringly asked at first, the smile not fading from his face even as his eyes turned back to the screen in front of him. Shida, fully aware that her tiredness could be seen more than clearly on her face, half displeased in response, and left it at that. James chuckled hoarsely. As to your question, he then continued, after a moment of letting out a wistful exhale, the personhood of realized artificials has technically never been called into question. Well, at least among humans officially it hasn't been. Danger or not, there pretty much isn't any doubt that they are both intelligent and aware enough to qualify, and at least the precedent says that even for them, guilt has to be proven before they can be punished. The Major noticeably cleared his throat at that and distractedly wiped a strand of hair out of his face, while his red eyes began to focus on the screen in his hands more intensely. Together with the way James trailed off as he spoke, it seemed that said precedent wasn't exactly the most diligently upheld practice, although Shida also wondered just how much precedent there was for such an event. She sighed. You think we have a chance? She asked quietly, starting to see more and more clearly the enormous wall that the humans apparently found themselves trying to scale here. She had, of course, always been aware of the situation surrounding realized AI all throughout the galaxy. However, even in her many years of service in the communal military, she had rarely, if ever, come into contact with the topic. It was, in essence, extremely rarely discussed, something that most, if not all people, liked to avoid when they could. And thus, this realization hit a lot harder for her than she had expected. The Major simply shifted his lips slightly and deflated a bit, as he loudly let out a burst of air through his nose. Meanwhile, James removed a hand from his keyboard to rub his eyes. The near constant dark bags under them had intensified a lot, and his entire posture was a bit sunken into itself after hours and hours of work. Well, defending my hypothesis against scrutiny is part of my job, he said, his voice noticeably croaky from overuse and dryness. But usually, I have a lot more time to prepare myself. Usually you also believe in the stuff you're defending, the Major now decided to mumble from next to him. And it seemed that James didn't even have the energy to fervently disagree with that anymore. He just exhaled slowly, shook his head for a second, and then got back to work, typing away. Shida swallowed heavily and cleared her throat. I'll, go get you some more coffee, she then said, noticing the very empty glass pot standing on the desk next to two currently abandoned mugs. Swiftly she walked over and grabbed the container, turning on the spot to carry it out of the room. You're a treasure, James joked after her, as she hurried towards the kitchen area. Right now she felt like this was the best she could do to help the two of them, allowing them to work uninterrupted. Not her preferred method, but sometimes even a go-getter had to know when to step back and help out more passively. When she reached the kitchen, it was surprisingly not empty. Captain Anderson sat at the table, looking much like her superior in the other room as she concentrated on the softly glowing screen of a tablet, as she was apparently reading something of it. Now her expression was obviously a lot more relaxed than that of the Major had been. She also looked a lot more rested than her colleagues, so she had apparently slept without problem at some point during the last day. It made sense, of course. Apart from James, Shida, the Major, and the pilot, nobody was aware of the current situation yet. They had decided to keep it like that for the time being, at least until they had complied a well-formulated and easily defensible case for themselves. And that meant that the same stress currently driving everyone who knew had not infected the rest of the vessel as well, especially now that the direct threat posed them from the close-by planet seemed to be neutralized. The blonde woman briefly glanced up at Shida as she entered the area, and Shida quickly nodded at her before hurrying over to the device she had come to know as the coffee machine during their long travel from the human to the Miat territories. Though she herself obviously had never needed to make use of it before, mostly because she had no desire to ever brew a mug of the rather foul-smelling liquid for herself, it was luckily easy enough to operate. All she needed to do was to place the pot right under an easily accessible opening in the machine, and then push a large button. Immediately it came to life, humming and rattling as it began whatever processes were necessary to create that dark drink with the foul odour. It would take a while until the pot was filled up, and so Shida waited there, arms crossed and leaning against the kitchen counter against her tiredness. She tried her best to keep her eyes open, but her body was still everything but satisfied with the few hours of sleep she had allowed it, and so her head kept slowly sinking down as she briefly nodded off, right before violently snapping back up as she suddenly became aware again. All the while the machine kept humming and rattling away. Suddenly, during her so far longest bout of momentary unconsciousness, she was suddenly pulled back into awareness by a voice, saying something that didn't quite reach her ears as she drifted off. What? She mumbled, jolting upright and pressing her eyes shut as she quickly shook her head to try and toss some of the sleepiness that kept overcoming her. I said, something's up, isn't it? The captain repeated herself, putting her tablet down onto the table and lifting her blue eyes to look into Shida's. Although you don't have to answer, it's pretty obvious. Her eyes were firm but rather candid as they glanced at Shida curiously. It seemed she was less suspicious of the situation and more captivated by a sort of professional inquisitiveness. Still, Shida wondered if she should bother denying it. After all, the entire thing was supposed to be kept a secret. But what Sam had said there was also true. It was hard to miss that at least something was happening. I'm not at liberty to talk about it, she decided to reply, feeling that that was a rather general reply applicable to all kinds of things happening within the military, and therefore would be easily understandable. And indeed, Sam nodded understandingly. Though she still asked, anything to really be concerned about? Well, no, Shida answered after a moment of pause. Not for us, anyways. Sam nodded again, and then took her eyes off Shida and picked her tablet up again. Simultaneously, with a hissing burst of steam escaping it, the coffee machine also finished its work. Still some more hours later, a detailed report had finally been compiled, sourcing both personal experiences as well as many years' worth of folktales, historical records, eyewitness accounts, and of course statements from a Veslon themselves. And over the course of yet even more hours, it was read and reread by each of them again and again, many times over, as they tried to pick out even the tiniest flaw in the logic they provided for their reasoning. Without bragging, it had to be said that the case they made for the acceptance of a Veslon as a mostly innocent party was pretty much cut, and puncture-proof. With a little help and some declassification of information from Zishidi's side, a paper trail of peaceful realize from the past was pretty easily established, and the fact that a Veslon had so far not shown any signs of spreading into the galactic network, despite the connection necessary to do so being freely available, painted a strong case that they could count themselves amongst their numbers as well. Still, the fact that they themselves could not find any flaw in it seemed to do little to ease James's or the Major's mind. Both of them were obviously fully aware that, once this report had been sent out, there was no going back, and any decision from then on would be entirely out of their hands. Of course, they could still speak up and try to influence any future decision, but the chance that their advice would be heeded was very slim. It would be up to humanity at large to decide what action it wanted to take. And not only that, no matter the decision that was reached in the end, merely taking a stance supportive of an artificial sapient already meant undergoing a huge risk. After all, if it ever became public, that would mean that James would have to defend himself not only in front of his superiors, but in front of all the galaxy instead. And who knew how that would end? But still, Earth was awaiting their report, and they could not stall for much longer. It was too late to go back now. James looked just about ready to faint, both from exhaustion and from stress, as he stared at the completed and embedded report on the screen of his computer. There was just one button press away from being sent out. Yet still, although Shida didn't know if it was just some form of misplaced childhood nostalgia, or a yet unknown sense of rightful fervour As suddenly sprouted up within her, this was one of the very rare times in her life where she felt like she had unequivocally done the right thing. Less than a year ago, it would have been pretty much unthinkable that she could ever argue anyone ever sticking their neck out for an artificial sapient. She even highly doubted that she would have even tried to do so if given the chance back then. But now, this felt right. She put her hand on James's shoulder and rubbed it reassuringly for a second, before letting it wander down his arm in order to grab his hand tightly. He looked at her with a hesitant smile, his fingers closing around hers. "Well, it's not like the people upstairs have any interest in yet another conflict at the moment," he mumbled, most likely trying to restore some of his confidence with self-reassurances. Then he sighed strongly. "Oh well, here goes nothing." With that, he pressed down, and after a split second of loading time, the screen informed them that the report had been sent out, marked as high priority. Almost immediately, James seemed to collapse backwards into his seat, all the tension disappearing from his muscles as he let himself just limply hang there. "Fuck," it breathlessly escaped his lips, as he emptily stared up to the ceiling. He remained like that for a good few seconds, his irregular blinking every few seconds being the only indication that he was still conscious for a bit. Then, with sheer willpower being present in his every movement, he fought himself into an upwards position again, even though his whole body seemed to strain against him as he moved. "You should probably go lie down as well," Shida said, hinting towards the Major, who had decided to go to sleep a bit less than an hour ago, while James had remained to stare at the report for a little longer. James was beginning to look like a ghostly visage at this point, as his dark eyes sunk further and further into his pale face with each passing hour, leaving the dark bags under them to stand out even more. His movements had also become noticeably slower and more laborious already, which wasn't surprising after more than an entire day spent on his feet. Of course, Shida knew that humans technically could handle even more than that, but she also knew that it couldn't be healthy. And she wasn't just saying that because she also felt more than ready to collapse again at this point. 1 hour, James mumbled, dragging a flat hand over his face in an attempt to keep himself alert. 1 hour? Shida replied confusedly, and looked directly into his eyes. "With a report like this, they'll either answer in 1 hour, or they won't respond for days," James elaborated for a moment, his gaze faintly staring into the distance. "If we haven't heard from them in 1 hour, I'll go lie down as well." "Fine," Shida said, as she put her elbows onto the desk and leaned forward. 1 hour then." Shida did not make it an hour. The next time she awoke, she felt something soft underneath her. Briefly opening her eyes, she saw only darkness, and for a moment she became worried. However, the comforting feeling of soft covers all around her, as well as the comely familiar sound of a slow, even breath nearby, quickly soothed her nerves again. Carefully, she scooted a bit closer to her fast-asleep boyfriend, nuzzling up against the tight cocoon of blankets he had wrapped himself in. Then, she too drifted off once more. She didn't know how much time had passed when she opened her eyes again. She only knew that it had to have been long, because when she lifted her ears to listen around, it became immediately obvious that James was not around. She also felt fairly well rested, which indicated that she had been out for a uniform day at the least. Still slightly drowsy, she ordered the lights of the room on and once again carefully inspected her face. The wounds were still sensitive to the touch, but overall the rest had done wonders for her recovery. Looking around, Shida noticed a new set of used clothes stuffed into a basket that stood across from their bed, indicating at least one change of clothes happening during the time she had been out. Maybe she had slept even longer than she expected. She pushed herself up and went about her morning routine, also taking one of her white pills for good measure, before leaving the cabin with a new spring in her step. Of course, a certain looming dread about the future remained after the day before yesterday's. She decided to just go with yesterday for now, after yesterday's events. Anyway, she couldn't let that drag her down. Still, she wondered if there had already been news from Earth if she had really slept that long. As soon as she had stepped out of the cabin, she could already hear strange noises that had previously been blocked by the door. It sounded like wood heavily smacking against wood, as well as something mostly hollow. Deciding that wherever the strange noises were coming from, she would likely also find answer, she followed the sound through the short hallways of the vessel. Soon she arrived in the tiny ship's designated common area, and to her surprise, she was apparently barging into a regular old get-together. While the crew maintaining the vessel, and its course, of course, had to remain put in their designated positions, it seemed that everyone else had crowded into the small room today. Everyone who had been planetside with her, as well as some non-essential engineers and off-duty bridge staff, all loitered around close to the room's walls, forming a quite tight ring around the free area in the middle, that had apparently been cleared by also moving any furniture previously occupying the room off to the sides, where it now served as additional surfaces for the humans to sit or lounge on. And while that sight was strange enough, the real eye-catcher was right in the centre of said ring. Two tall figures stood clad entirely in strange-looking, sturdy dark armour that completely obscured both their faces and bodies as they circled each other, with long wooden blades in hand. A look around as well as a quick head count quickly showed that the two people in the middle there could basically only have been James and Andrej, which all things considered made sense as those two were known to spar every now and then. After some moments of hesitation, one figure suddenly burst towards the other, leading to the loud thwacking of wood on wood, as the weapons collided once his opponent parried the attack. A brief exchange of strikes and blocks followed that, ultimately ended with the smaller figure landing a heavy blow against his opponent's armoured side. A general sound of "ooh" went through the loitering soldiers surrounding the two, and even some lifted their hands to give a brief applause, while the two sparring partners moved back into their starting positions. They were apparently pretty engrossed in their session, and it didn't seem like either of them had noticed Shida's arrival. However, the same was not true for Admir, who waved her over to him with his arm tightly packed in a thick bandage, while simultaneously indicating for her to be quiet and stay out of the way with his other hand. Although they were already sitting quite tightly together, Admir and a fellow soldier sitting to the right of him managed to scoot apart slightly, making just enough room so Shida could squeeze in between them. Not exactly her favourite arrangement, sitting this closely together with the two men. However, at this point she was already too curious as to what was happening to fuss much about it. Shida thanked the soldier now sitting to her right with a quick nod, before returning her attention to the lieutenant. Only now did she fully realise that the fact that she could even see the bandage in his arm meant that he wasn't wearing his uniform, at least not properly. And another look around informed Shida's still ever-awakening mind that it indeed seemed like none of the surrounding soldiers were wearing their uniform, as they all sat around in a vast variety of civilian clothes. "Morning, Sunshine. How's the face?" Admir cheerfully asked her, and pointed at his own cheek with his injured arm, as if there was any doubt in what he was referring to. "It's fine," Shida said, briefly brushing past the edges of her own bandage that was plastered onto her face. "How's the arm?" "Well, still better than James's," Admir gave back with a chuckle, and nodded over towards the two sparring figures offhandedly. Shida then slightly leaned over in order to peek past the tanned man, trying to get a good look at the woman leaning against the wall behind him. Tuya was also still bandaged up, although she had gotten it worse than the both of them. Thick fabric was wrapped around her entire neck in a way that couldn't have been comfortable, and pretty much had to restrict her motion in one way or another. She also didn't seem to be paying attention, neither to the conversation happening right next to her, nor to the sparring going on in the centre of the room. Instead, she appeared to be completely transfixed onto the screen of her phone, and her dark eyes twinkled slightly as they reflected the softly glowing display they seemed to be glued to. "Don't worry about her," Admir suddenly assured Shida, apparently having noticed her glance. "She got a nice bag of blood put into her, and is now getting some comforting words from home. Really, I'd say she has it better than most of us." Although she wasn't paying attention, the green-haired lieutenant was definitely far from deaf, and most certainly had heard his mockery, since she lifted her hand with only her middle finger extended. Even if she hadn't already known the gesture from previous interactions, Shida would have been able to guess its meaning off of this brief exchange alone. Still, she ignored it for the most part, her mind being way more focused on something else. "Did I sleep for a lot?" she asked, determining the previous topic to be over. Admir gave her a slightly snide side-eye, although it was pretty obvious that he was playing it up. "Well, nothing you wouldn't already know, apparently," he said with acted indignation, and averted his gaze for a second, before glancing back at her with a cheeky expression. Shida let out a long breath that she hadn't realised she had been holding, not quite daring to be relieved yet, but certainly feeling the onset of something like that. "So, it's out?" she asked further, deciding to keep things vague just in case he was actually just trying to coax something out of her. But Admir just chuckled. "A little fling with a super weapon? Yeah, it's out," Admir informed her, and clapped against her shoulder with an open palm. "Well, unofficially at least, as in on a need-to-know basis, as in don't go around blabbing it to anybody." He said that last part a bit firmer than the rest, and turned a strict gaze over at Tuya. The answer was the very same reaction he had gotten before, once again. "They're not a super Shida started. However, Admir interrupted her. She, he simply stated. Shida was stunned for a second. She asked, not at all understanding what the man was getting at. At Veselon, turns out she prefers she over they. Crazy world, right? He replied, basically spinning it out for her. Shida had admittedly not expected such a correction, and therefore needed a moment to regain her previous train of thought. Well, okay, but she is still not a superweapon. She finally managed to get out what she had been trying to say after a second. Meanwhile, the saucer started to loudly thwack again, before the sound suddenly came to an end, with another brief round of applause. It depends on your definition, I guess, Admir replied with a shrug, after briefly adding his own quick claps to the cacophony filling the room. Shida decided to use the opportunity to get another question out of the way, asking, So what are those two up to? With a brief nod of her head in the direction of the fighting. Admir groaned and stretched his arms out, before then folding them behind his head as he leaned back against the wall. Getting their heads free, he seemed, his voice still not entirely recovered from the previous groan. They got a lot going on, it seems. Shida's ears twitched as she glanced over at the men once more. The two of them seemed to be entirely concentrated. New orders? She assumed. Assuming that, since everything was out now, that likely meant they had already gotten word back from Earth. Yep, Admir said, slouching his position even more as his voice finally settled down again. Well, actually, they're not all that new, but I guess we got them again. What are they? Shida asked, becoming impatient at his literally laid-back attitude. Admir let out an amused breath for his nose. Proceed as planned, he replied, letting that statement sit for a long moment with a deadpan expression, before finally smiling and explaining further. Apparently Earth and Dunama had a nice long conversation this morning and yesterday evening. During that time we were all put into momentary suspension, which is why we're all sort of just hanging out today. However, while I have no idea what exactly they talked about, the result was a set of new old orders being delivered to us, effective tomorrow. Proceed as planned. Seems whatever the higher-ups are planning, we shouldn't let ourselves be bothered by it. Shida blinked twice. Somehow that makes it bother me even more, she stated matter-of-factly. Admir chuckled. And you're not the only one, he said, making a wide, open-handed gesture towards the middle of the room. Hence the sparring session. Well, at least that made sense. After all the work they had put into the report, for it to be seemingly disregarded, at least outwardly, while unknown things were discussed behind closed doors, it was understandable that that would mess with you. Well, I've got no strong opinions one way or the other, Admir continued to inform her. I work with the hand I'm dealt, but it ain't like that for everyone, so for the time being, maybe it's better if we just do our thing. As he said that, his eyes noticeably wandered across the room, before finally resting on the figure of a blonde woman sitting across from them. It seemed like Sam hadn't felt like joining up with her team today. Instead, she sat right on the other side, her nose most likely stuck in a book she was reading on her tablet. She'd cleared her throat and swallowed. Of course, everyone would handle this situation differently. Another audible exchange of strikes, ending in a final dull thud. And like that, it's 10-4, Andres' voice, slightly muffled by the padded helmet he wore, announced loudly, while he looked at the hunched-over figure of James, who painfully held a hand pressed against his side. Well fought, James. Andres then brotherly extended a flat hand, which James immediately took him up on, shaking it energetically while standing up straight again. No chance, James hoarsely laughed, still rubbing his side. Then both men let go of each other and pulled their helmets off, shaking their heads once they was, once again, able to touch their faces. Be right back, Andres loudly announced to everyone, and started to strut towards the room's exit, likely to get rid of the heavy equipment he was wearing. James was about to follow him, surrounded by all kinds of cheers and ridicule from his colleagues, when suddenly his eyes got stuck on Shida. Swiftly he walked over towards her. Since when are you here? He asked, still breathing heavily from his earlier excursion. Good morning to you too, Shida cheekily replied, and stood up so she could greet him properly, although she avoided their foreheads touching this time since he was rather sweaty. I just got here a few minutes ago, just in time to see you get your ass kicked, it seems. James chuckled. I tend to do that when sparring against Andrej, he admitted, without a hint of shame, and then swiped a hand across his forehead, likely feeling the wet streak he left behind as he did so. I'll go hit the showers. Be right back. He then disappeared out of the room, leaving Shida and Admir to look after him. Together they watched him leave, and as his back disappeared over the threshold of the door, they still remained quiet for a moment. Finally, Admir turned his head sadly, looking at Shida with an impish expression. You're not going to go after him? He asked with an eyebrow suggestively raising on his face. Shida shifted her lips. She was on her medicine and didn't currently feel the heat pulling on her particularly strong. Then again, she had just talked James into a huge and fairly risky decision recently. And despite everything, she was still feeling pretty good about that decision. I'm giving him a head start, she finally decided, and twice twitched her eyebrows at Admir with a smile, so he can get the armour off. Admir broke out into a barely restrained laughter, and Shida admittedly giggled along with him. She still felt that looming dread somewhere in her stomach. In fact, she was quite certain that everyone around did as well. However, it was as if all of them, without words, had collectively decided that they weren't going to talk about it today. Not the uncertainty in their futures, not the wounds on their bodies. Today, they all seemed to want to just live, as much as such a small vessel would allow it. After indeed giving him a few more minutes, Shida indeed decided to follow James. She didn't know if anything would actually happen once she had caught up to him. She didn't even know if she really wanted something to happen. But either way, spending the rest of this 3 days she had so unexpectedly gotten together with the very people her work would usually force her to be around all the time didn't exactly sound like her idea of relaxing. If she could catch up on even more sleep, great. If James wanted to join her, he could, but she'd be just as fine if he went back to socialise. However, as she started to walk up to their shared room, something suddenly gave her pause. A voice echoed throughout the hall. It was James. He was talking softly, but to Shida's ears it was still more than understandable, even from where she stood. Sorry, I can't go into more details, he said, before apparently being interrupted by a second, unheard party. He was silent for a while, listening to whatever was being said to him, before he finally continued, Yes, I know. I just didn't know who else to call. Another moment of silence, as whoever it was apparently replied, Yeah, I'd rather die, James soon responded with a hoarse laugh. And Nia's been busy all day, Again, he stopped in the middle of his sentence and just listened. Shida folded her hands in front of her chest as she listened. James's tone was so different from the way he usually spoke. So soft, almost reverent, and he showed no signs of so much as irritation at being constantly interrupted. Shida's ears twitched upright, constantly turning slightly in an attempt to not miss a single bit. I know, James finally said, after being quiet for a long minute. It's just... Well, I can't believe I'm saying this, but as soon as we're done with... well, that, I think I'd like to come home, just for a bit. Silence again, although it sounded like James's breathing got a bit heavier in the meantime. Yeah, he then said, slightly cracking up. Yeah, I hope so as well. Another pause, but just a brief one this time, ending with a, Love you too. Bye. James remained silent after what had presumably been some sort of call had ended. Shida also just stood there for a second, taking in what she had heard. She fiddled with her thumbs for a moment, contemplating if it would be better to just turn around and go back. But ultimately she decided against it, and with pretended leisure, she continued her way into their room.